Quality Management Committee will come to order. Before we get into the agenda, I'd like to recognize a few people in our audience. Brian Housen, Amber Unruh, who did the Mill Pond study. Selectman Brown, you can be an honorary member of this committee, you keep coming. And a different observer from the league, Mrs. Ziss. First item on the agenda is a discussion of the draft proposal for the implementation plan to meet TMDL compliance for the Oyster Pond watershed. That was worked on by a subgroup that was John and Steve and myself. But one of you two want to sort of lay out?
Yeah, let me just sort of lead into that. So on face value, this looks like we're planning to deal with the watershed at Oyster Pond with advanced IA systems. And that may be ultimately our goal, but that is not our primary goal with this document. So what we're trying to do with this, we can't successfully deal with a watershed with IAs until we have an arrangement with DEP on how the town might manage such an entity. So this is our attempt to put together a management plan that we plan to present to DEP to see if they will buy into our scheme for how we might manage such a watershed. So although it will say Oyster Pond all the way through, the public shouldn't get the idea that we've settled on dealing with that watershed with advanced IAs. This is just a management plan. The other secondary thing it does is we're trying to push the vendors. IA systems which treat for nitrogen at the state level are mandated to remove 50% of the nitrogen or at a level of 19 milligrams per liter. We think the technology has moved on from there. We're trying to push the vendors to get down below 10. And so this is part of this. You will see in this scheme that there are criteria that we're trying to send up to DEP to say, here's how we think we can get 10, and we want you to help us get there. So with that, I think we can walk our way through.
Why don't you go section by section? This was sent around to all the members about a week ago, I guess.
And many parts of it we've seen before, so
Right.
I think you want to highlight the parts that are new.
Right.
Does kind of feel like Groundhog Day with this document.
Yeah, this is the 25th iteration.
One of the problems we have with the enterprise is that as we're making sausage, they report on the sausage before we have the finished product. And so if they can hold off until we've settled on something, that would be nice.
So I believe sections 1 and 2 are the same.
We've added a couple of definitions that weren't there before. I
Oh,
think they're
okay.
pretty straightforward.
Good.
The section 3.11 has been modified a little bit. George and I thought that 4.5 kilowatt hours per day is more realistic than 2, although George thinks there are some that can pull it down to 2. But here again, this is a number to try and push the vendors to building these systems so that they're energy efficient.
And there was no requirement in the previous version for energy efficiency.
Yes,
Or there
in the one
was.
that we've looked at most recently, there was.
Oh, yeah, and I'd just like to back up a little before we jump ahead so far.
Yes.
Okay. No, I'm just wondering, you know, mg/L, I guess people know what that is, right? Most people in the world know milligram per liter is mg/L.
The target audience for this is not most people.
This is
it's
the DEP.
Okay, all right. So, all right, before we get to 3.11 then, going back to 3.1, just as a editorial thing, normally when you talk about milligrams of something, the normal notation in scientific publications is 10 milligrams, in this case, dash or hyphen TN/L. That's the normal, it's a simple thing there. So that's something to consider. The second thing in that is the English, the grammar aspect. And that is that it says IA systems meeting less than 10 milligrams total nitrogen /liter or 75% removal. So meeting less than 75% removal, it should say at least 75% removal. Okay, as opposed to less than, because then it could be 50% or something. The other element in that too is the word or that concerns me, in that how do you determine 75%?
So,
I mean, the milligram per liter, I know, and that way, and that is
Can I suggest,
milligram per liters in the effluent, so we know what we're talking about. So it's, that should be kind of specified,
That sound all right?
that.
Well, it has a practical implication because it implies that you need to make two measurements for enforcement.
what we're doing at the Board of Health, at the same time we're doing this, the Board of Health is rewriting its local regulations. And one of the things DEP has never done for these IA systems is had a criterion for failure. And so in rewriting our local regulations, we're about at the third iteration. Those regulations will go out for a public hearing after the first of the year. And very clearly laid out in there is, you first ask them to meet 10 milligrams per liter. If they can't meet it, there's a whole system on how you do it by mass balance to get to 75%. So if someone has got a very high input system that's coming in at 100 instead of what the state thought was 38, and you can show that you can remove 75% of that 100, you will pass. And so that's why this is either or.
can I suggest a rephrasing, maybe, that would clarify it a little bit?
Well, we could, maybe these kind of issues, the grammatical and the phraseology.
Just send them to us.
Could be sent by email,
Send them to me and I'll work
and we
them.
can incorporate them all, because I don't think it's fair to.
Well, should we go through it now or not?
Well,
Should we go through the document now?
For the kind of
Well, this,
corrections we've been seeing so far, those could be better handled by an email, but certainly keep going through the
right. But-
document so we can get into the substance of it.
Well, coming back to this one element here too, is that I still don't know how you would get how you'd know 75%, sort of based on the effluent rate.
You have to measure the influent, which is the way I was trying to rephrase it.
Yeah, well,
You don't need to rephrase it here because it
Yeah.
will be dealt
Right.
with very specifically in the local upgrade of the Board of Health regulations.
So-
John, I think I can satisfy Ron here. If you skip ahead just to the picture in Appendix 1, or just maybe you already know, there's a nitrifying component, a settling tank and a nitrifying
Yeah.
component before the denitrifying. So that provides an obvious place to make your input measurement of nitrogen, where you don't have to worry about solids.
Okay, well, whatever, I mean, to
Then you
me,
just
it's
do the
hard
ratio.
to know, I mean, you could say refer to that and it'll explain it or something. But the other element is that later on it talks about a mean of 10. And here there's no mention of a mean of 10. The mean of 10 is mentioned later on regarding this, so it's sort of an inconsistency.
So, there again, the Board of Health local regulation will go through precisely how the probationary period works, how it has to be monitored. And the two documents are meant to go up to DEP at the same time. So when we send this to DEP for their comments, they're going to get the new local regulations from the Board of Health, which lay out in some detail how you can measure what these systems are doing.
Well, I would suggest this be a standalone, even if it's just a footnote. Okay, it should be a standalone document, because not everybody, I would have a footnote that explains, makes this a little clearer. Including the mean, because later on you do talk about a mean, and that makes sense, of course, but it's something there.
Can you keep going, John?
But we already jumped ahead a little bit further. With the 4.5, I talked to George, he said really the target would be better to set it at 2.5.
Kilowatts.
I had an exchange with him, and he said 2.5, that's 2.5 kilowatt hours per day versus 4.5 kilowatt hours per day. 4.5 is a lot. And he thinks 2.5 is reasonable.
Okay, John?
We've been going back and forth, so we can settle on that. This is basically, DEP is not gonna care whether we say 2.5 or 4.5. What that's meant to do is to push the vendors.
Yeah, right.
We're trying to make the vendors think about energy, which they haven't given it.
Well, that's why he and I went back and forth, and 2.5 was a better target for the vendors than 4.5.
What's the, maybe we could just go back and remind everybody what the goal of this document is. And it's really just to get a sense from the state of whether or not they would approve such a management plan for IA systems, right? This is not, we're not gonna write this into law
No.
anytime soon.
No, the ultimate goal is to put this in with our CWMP at the end of 2019. In other words, the state says, that's a fine management plan, we agree to it, or we agree to it with these changes, it will become part of that document.
You've been talking to George. Is 2.5 versus 4.5, is it,
I'm happy to push it to 2.5,
okay.
but I think that's just academic at this point.
Well, things keep moving down the road sometimes, you know, so it's better to start.
I thought that you had to have it at 4.5 to ensure that you had at least 2 vendors.
Let's not worry about that at this point.
All right.
What we're doing is asking the state, and if there are 10 vendors, and 8 of them come back and say, there's no way we could ever make 2.5, we can think about changing the number.
Okay, keep going.
Anything else on the first page?
I would simplify 3.11, would put in must instead of shall, because shall is kind of I think it's kind of loose, but whatever goes there, I think it could read, shall be configured such that no more than 1 pump for conveyance of fluid is necessary, and total power consumption of all components is less than 4.5, or whatever the number is we end up with, and drop the phrase that say no systems will be allowed.
Send the email and I'll fix it.
Yeah, I will. I'll
Yep, that's the
discuss
way.
it with you.
Okay.
Any question on the phased implementation? All of this we've seen in other iterations, and we've been through each of these
Yep.
subpoints.
Right.
So really, the next thing that is new is the appendix.
So, well, we can, I have a few more comments, yeah. On 4.5.2, after probation period, again, well, it talks, as I mentioned earlier, there is a discussion in that about the mean or equivalent nitrogen load reductions has reached the required standard of, or target of 10 milligrams. There it is, right, dash and TN. It could have, it's better phrased there, but there could be a hyphen between milligram. But the point is that, or again, removal of 75% of total nitrogen.
That was the correction you made before, right? So we'll just.
Well,
repeat
it's
it again.
different. In this case, you wouldn't write at least, you'd say removal of, well, or, yeah, similar. But the, fine, okay. And then in 4.6, I would say if, the last sentence, if at any future time a system's effluent, not a system's effluent is found to exceed. Because the system is something different from what we're talking about. It's just a,
Yep.
I was editor-in-chief of my high school newspaper, so the thing is, sort of, you know, put in there.
Well, that was
And-
before we had email, but now we have email, so you
Right. While we're,
So it's just like, you know, it's sort of whatever, it's sort of there, but,
you can send
but
me
again, and then,
and we'll fix
you
it.
know, yeah.
I'd like to maybe suggest that in a situation where we find an exceedance, that we make a provision for immediate resampling, because weird things happen. Samples get sent to the lab, other things happen, and you get an outlier of some kind. And I would hate to see the whole probationary thing, expensive and all, to start over again after one exceedance. So I would suggest a provision that the turnaround time, I think, is gonna be pretty quick. And as soon as we find, or they find, we're not gonna be doing it, find an exceedance, that we arrange for an immediate resampling to be done. And then if we see two exceedances, we can say, yeah, there's something wrong here. That's my only concern there, is if you have one mistake.
Right.
And I think that's built into the local reg, the way
Okay.
that's done. So, and we can, if we need to just change that here after we've gotten to the final version of that local reg, that goes into much more detail. There's several pages
Yeah.
of how
Right.
that's
This
to work.
might be worth adding right now, though, because it's. Exactly, maybe the other one won't be ready in January. We want to get moving here.
Yeah.
Okay, a lot of this is very similar. Now, the appendix you say is new. I apologize to the audience. We should probably have at least some of this up on the screen, so someone besides us could know what we're talking about. But
So the appendix is really there just to, again, to push DEP to say, here's what we're thinking of asking these systems to do. And one of the main things that George and I were anxious to do was to get away from a soil absorption system and go back to a pit. So if you have an effluent which is less than 10 milligrams per liter and has a BOD of less than 30, and a TSS of less than 30, you ought to be able to use a small pit. And that will save us a huge amount of money. So that's going to be something that pushes DEP pretty hard. They're going to have to think about that, because that's going back to the pre-95 code. And that's one of the main purposes of this appendix. And then basically was to put the vendors on notice. There are a number of components that are available through the DEP approval letters, which will nitrify very successfully, but we're gonna push them pretty hard to denitrify with a chamber with a cellulosic medium that only has to replace every 5 years and can be replaced without digging up the pit.
John, a technical question just occurred to me. In the cases of where you're meeting the 75% removal, because your input is really high, so you're allowed to have, that your output can be significantly higher than the 10 milligrams per liter? What's the worst that could be? 40?
I think the pit argument works if the nitrogen number is not so important. It's the BOD and TSS. And
Oh,
I
okay.
think that those we can pull down pretty successfully.
You see where I was gonna go with that.
Right, so in other words, if you had 100 coming in and you could only get it down to 15, is DEP gonna say, well, that isn't low enough for you to be able to use a pit? You're gonna have
Exactly.
to use a soil absorption.
Only
And I
would be
think that's
25.
that's a discussion we can have with DEP as we go through this process.
I mean, my same comments are here about, you know, the 10 milligrams total nitrogen and the at least 75% in the title. But in this little drawing here, it looks like you're talking about, you could be read 9 kilowatt hours, even though it should be small k, big W, small h, but 4.5 kilowatt hours combined with 4.5. You see, so it's a little confusing. It could be not, so in reading it, it looks like it could be
But under
9.
number 3, under system requirements, it's completely clear.
And it says, if you read it, it says each one is combined with the other for a maximum of 4.5.
And, yeah, number 3
Well, it
clears it
doesn't
up.
quite,
Just get rid of the text in parentheses in the box.
Yes.
And the bullet point number
Three.
Says it all.
And then
Takes it
down
all.
below,
Yeah,
it
I
says
think
2 point, it should be 2.5, but it should be, or could be 2.5. But anyway, yeah, that, I think I agree with that.
That's that way because I couldn't manipulate what was inside George's box.
Okay.
I'm not sure George can.
I'm concerned that you have just this, one conceptual model, for a system when potentially others would be acceptable. I understand that you're trying to push potentially new thinking with respect to the discharge pit here, but how do you make it clear that that wouldn't be the only approach?
Well, the discharge pit, if we can get DEP to acquiesce to that, would be just as effective as a field and much less expensive. So at that point, I mean, if DEP will sign on to that, we'll use it. If someone has a field at their house that's still in good shape, there's no reason that we couldn't use it without putting in anything. And I don't think we need to put that sort of detail in here.
Well, but there's a more fundamental point, is that part of your thinking, correct me if I'm wrong, was that John wanted to limit them so that the training and skills of the people doing all the inspection can be simplified.
Right.
They don't have to know how to maintain 25 different kinds of systems, only ones that meet this criteria.
So
The same idea as when we specified a single kind of grinder pump for the little pond area, instead of letting everybody go out and get their own.
So the management entity would put out an RFP and say, we want the vendors to bid on systems that will meet these criteria. And if we get back 5 successful bidders, then we could encourage those 5 people to pick from that group of 5. But I think what we don't want is these really fancy systems where you're adding some system and some soluble component every week and it recirculates back. We're trying to make it work but be simple. And I think that's what we're pushing these guys to do.
And just one more point about the pit. How confident are you and George that, you wouldn't get any additional nitrogen removal benefit?
From a soil absorption system?
Yeah, I mean, could you potentially be
I-
giving up some?
I think you'd be giving up
Benefit.
very little, but George has been running the pits out with some of his systems and is quite confident we can make that work.
DEP may have that same point.
Hey, Doug Brown,
Doug Brown.
would it be a good idea to add a little carbon medium underneath the pit, just to volunteer that and say, just in case there was any problem, that would maybe sell them on the pit a little more?
I think what we do is send it up to DEP and get them to react. And, we don't want to make it any more complicated than possible. If you're putting cellulose underneath the pit, that's suggesting that at some point in the future, you're going to have to dig the pit up to replace the cellulose. If you have the cellulose in a tank where you can take the cover off and suck the old medium out and replace it with new medium without having to dig up and excavate, that's sort of the idea of where we're trying to push it.
This isn't an empty pit. It has material in it.
Which pit? This pit is
discharge pit.
simply a cement block pit with crushed stone around it.
Oh, I beg your pardon.
Just the way
It is
the-
empty
The old
pit.
style
Just
pit
the
where
way
you
the
couldn't put a field.
pre-95 Title V worked.
Well,
I see.
if you put carbon under it, you're going back to an idea that others, there was an idea about, hey, don't build anything, just go around with a root injector and put carbon under everybody's septic tank. Neat, right? Okay. The problem is, how do you monitor it? Because if you're gonna use it, I mean, there's no point putting it there unless you think it's gonna be needed and actually be doing something at some point. If it is, then you have to monitor downstream of it.
Right. But if they give us trouble, we'll throw this one in and see if it works. Any other comments on the draft from the committee? Any comments on the draft from Brian House?
Brian, you have
No, it's just, I know that Oyster Pond doesn't really have freshwater resources in the watershed, but if you go to pits, I haven't looked this up, I'm hearing this for the first time, but have you looked at the fact that if you do a pit, are you going to potentially get more phosphorus movement into those areas, like if you're within 300, 400, 500 feet of freshwater? Because the bigger leaching fields really do a great job at keeping the phosphorus in the ground. We don't have to worry about it. If we start compressing that area. So I don't know, but I'm bringing it up as something maybe the committee would like to look at and consider that, how they do it, that's all.
So and that is a consideration. One of the things we do in the local reg is we say that if your system is within so many feet of groundwater, you've got to treat it differently than, you get a infiltration rate and distance to groundwater, and that may mandate. So we may need to put in here that if the bottom of the pit is within 4 feet of groundwater, you've got to use a field.
Well, it also could be that if you're within some distance from a further, maybe the 300 to 600 foot distance from a freshwater resource, that then maybe you have to go to not a pit, or a slightly bigger pit, or,
Yeah,
but I don't know the answer. I'm just,
but that's the important point. We don't know the answer, and so I'm sort of
until you
of
look
the
at it.
same mindset of Brian on this. Until I see some data, I'm not in favor of proposing an approach that might have some unintended consequences.
But for nitrogen, I see no problem at all from my position in the
I
world.
think there's pretty good, we've got pretty good studies that phosphorus is absorbed pretty effectively
Yes, it is.
within a very short distance of
Right, but,
where it's.
But you're talking about a point source now.
yeah, it's just the compressing of it, not the fact you put it in a pit. Pits are great, but if you get too concentrated a source, then you start generating a phosphorus plume.
Just one other thing on that, though, my understanding is there's something called green sand that could possibly be put around these pits
Sure.
as well, that would help to absorb phosphorus if it is an issue. So there is a possible way to mitigate it if it's there.
All right,
So that's something we should think about.
yeah, let's put that into the thought process. All right, any other comments from the committee or the public on the 25th draft of the implementation plan? All right. Okay, well, thank you. We will move on. All right, having regaled the folks from East Falmouth with the fascinating subject of nitrogen removal in wastewater, we'll now
So-
talk about Mill Pond.
So if we have typos and whatnot, we should send those to
Just send them to
John.
me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, typos and grammatical and even
Other changes.
other
And it-
changes to
Sounds
John.
good.
Okay, Mill Pond.
Okay, why should we focus on Mill Pond after all this excitement on the oyster pond septics? Well, not for that reason. One of the reasons is it's a widely visible manifestation of water quality problems. It's a location, if you're driving by on Route 28, especially in the summertime, and you look off, you can see a lot of green out there. And I've had the experience of having passengers riding with me say, what's going on over there, and how come nobody's doing anything about it? So it's a very visible manifestation of nutrient loading in estuaries. And it was actually the case that it's not as if nobody's doing anything about it. In fact, there's a couple people here who've put significant effort into understanding what's going on. There was an SMAS study that covered the period of August 2015 to March 2018, and it was connected with a master's thesis that Amber Unruh did, and was the topic of a presentation she did on July 19th at the East Falmouth Village Association. And there were some specific recommendations that were connected to an underlying observation about Mill Pond, which is that it will be important to maintain or increase the high level of nitrogen attenuation in the pond for the health and restoration of green pond. And we recognize that green pond is on the list of impaired estuaries that needs attention from this committee right here. So preserving the functionality of Mill Pond is extremely important, and this report that Amber presented had some very specific recommendations intended to do exactly that. So recommendation number 1 was to add a upstream detention pond. The text suggested a 1/4 acre detention pond above the Mill Pond culvert that would allow particles to settle out before they get to Mill Pond. And the idea is that this would reduce the nitrogen and phosphorus loads by 192 and 40 kilograms per year potentially. This is an overhead view showing where the detention pond would be in the yellow outlined area there. And the idea would be to construct a perimeter with tractor access. As you look at the image, you can kind of see that there is essentially a perimeter already in place about where we'd want it to be, but it would need to be tuned up a little bit. And excavate the interior to a depth of 6 feet. There's locations on the bog owned by Mr. Handy that are capable of taking that material, so it doesn't need to be transported. We would want to monitor the water quality inside this detention pond and also track the sediment that's deposited there. So we'll have to think about some provisions to do that going forward. And in a very exciting development, this whole idea has the support of the bog owner, Brian Handy. And we met with him last week. Doug and Brian and Amber and a few others were all there. Mary Ellen and Riney was there, so it was quite a party. And Brian was very amenable to working together with us on this. Recommendation number 2 is related to harvesting the pond macrophytes. And just to understand what's going on here, the macrophytes are things that grow. They have roots going down into the water, into the pond sediments. And they take up about 450 kilograms of nitrogen and 10 kilograms of phosphorus. Just want to compare this with the detention pond recommendation. This is a nitrogen-heavy measure, whereas the other one was more balanced. But there's still phosphorus that would come out with this recommendation as well. The issue here is that the nutrients shift to the sediments when the macrophytes die. That's a process that consumes oxygen. And when anoxia occurs, the nutrients that have gone down to the bottom are then released back into the water column and have the potential to propagate down into Green Pond, where they could become more problematic. So how does one look at pond macrophyte management? Well, we see the macrophytes are taking up stored phosphorus from the sediments along with nitrogen and carbon. And so the idea is that if you can pick those macrophytes off the bottom without disturbing their roots, you can kind of continue to suck things out of the sediments. And so when you harvest those macrophytes, you get the nutrients out of the pond, and you also prevent anoxia from decay, so you're sort of preserving the oxygen in the pond. And increasing these dissolved oxygen levels over time should reduce the phosphorus loading in the summertime. And overall, we hope to improve the sediment environment, which would potentially enhance nitrogen removal by improved denitrification. So it's a synergistic effect if you start doing this pond macrophyte management. The key for the purposes of this discussion is that harvesting needs to happen. So how does harvesting take place? Well, turns out there's a whole industry that has devoted itself to building weed eaters that you can launch in the water. And you can see the scale of this thing. There's a few people off in the background here, and it's sitting about maybe 4 feet or more. The water line is about 4 feet above the ground. And so it's a fairly large piece of equipment, and you can acquire one, not at Home Depot, but for $75,000, you can have your very own weed eater and worry about insuring and maintaining and operating it yourself. Or you can call 1-800-TAKE-MY-WEEDS-AWAY and write a check for $15,000, and you'll get a one-time harvest of your macrophytes, plus or minus the 15K. Turns out that Brewster, who owns this wonderful piece of equipment that the same group that met with Mr. Handy went and visited the town of Brewster, they have this piece of equipment already. They use it for their ponds, and they're open to collaborating with Falmouth on a project to harvest macrophytes out of Mill Pond. There's one little detail. To get this wonderful weed eater off the trailer and into the water like this requires a little bit of planning. And so here's a picture of what the Mill Pond bathymetry looks like. And it's easy to see the dark areas down here. Somehow the scale didn't get converted to feet. That's 1.5 meters. So let's say it's around 5 feet at the deepest. And then at the rest of the area is maybe around 3 feet or so in this green area, and it goes down from there. There's a very narrow channel that's been dredged up here, but not quite enough to get that weed eater in and out, especially with a load back and forth a lot of times while you're performing the harvest. So there's really 2 locations that we've considered, A and B down here. And we'll just take a look at them in more detail. This is a nice map from the Assessor's Department that has, we'll put the bad area up there first. This is over by the public library, and you can see these contour lines. It's hard to see maybe in the picture, but it's a pretty steep area. And then when you get down to the water's edge, there's a very nice tree that a lot of people are fond of looking at, and the branches are not in a happy place for launching the weed eater. It stands fairly tall off the trailer. It's maybe about 10 feet from the ground. So it'd be difficult to launch it in this area, if not impossible, without taking a large part of that tree away and then messing up the grass. And that's a very good point. On the other side is Mill Pond Way. There's a nice shallow approach, and it goes into deep water. You can see the deep water here. You can see the shallow gradient on the contours. And there's only a few kind of small weeds that are in the way that could pretty easily be removed so that this weed eater could probably be launched. You can see this picture in Brewster in the upper left corner. They have a nice paved ramp going into the water. In an ideal world, we'd be able to add one of those, but I don't think we need to start there for a pilot project. And certainly it would be possible to run this trailer down in there and haul it back out. So the place where you launch is the same place where you extract the weeds as they're harvested. They land in the back area. It's sort of like a pickup truck that floats around. And it has paddle wheels on the left and the right, so it can spin itself and go back and forth. And so there'll be some activity back and forth to get the weeds out. But Brewster feels confident they could make it happen. What they need to see from us is a proposal saying when and where and other details like that. So they were very, very excited to work with us in an intermunicipal collaboration.
Terrific. Comments or questions from the committee? Matt?
When you say they're interested in a pilot, does that mean it would be at no cost, at least this initial trial basis, or when you?
They didn't say that.
Okay.
I think there would be, from their view, some sort of a transaction, an official document for insurance purposes and to cover they would send an operator as well. So I think we'd expect to cover that. They said as an upper limit, 15K.
Okay, so that's where you got the number.
It's unlikely they'd charge more than that.
Eric, the gross weight of the weed eater, do you know?
Loaded or unloaded? So
Well,
it's a
Well,
good question.
you're launching it empty and presumably hauling it limited, empty, and I'm just wondering what you might do to the shoreline there, because if you run the trailer down
Yeah.
through there.
Absolutely. It's a very good question. So it is a tandem axle trailer, and it's about 26 feet, or actually 28 feet from tongue to end.
Yeah,
And they tow it with a 1-ton pickup truck. They don't use a small truck.
good, because there'd be provisions, you could put down mats or something
And
for the,
that's what
for
they
the launch
suggested.
and take those back out and minimize it. The other thing I'm thinking about for offloading it, you could have they're dump trucks with orange peel grabs in them like they use for cleaning the catch basin and minor extension. You could probably have that truck on the same mat and unload that way.
It's a little tight to get 2 trucks in the right orient with the trailer and everything. You might be able to.
No, I just mean while you're unloading it, you wouldn't have the other truck there. This would be
Gotcha.
the truck that's gonna haul the stuff away.
Yeah, so there's actually, this is a conveyor belt in the bed. So ideally what you do is you drive it right up to the trailer and turn the conveyor on, and it just throws everything onto the trailer. But there are other
The
ways to.
trailer it's transported on.
Yes.
Oh,
And then you take that up to the
oh,
compost.
that simplifies things.
Yeah,
Okay, I was
yeah.
thinking of a totally separate vehicle involved, that
Yeah.
part, okay.
Matt?
And the FMES does have some plastic mats, like exactly what you're talking about, that could be used.
Ron?
Thanks, Eric. So we're looking at 2 possible interventions, right? One is the basin, and the other one is this harvester, right? So I thought there were some other options, but in terms of this, we had talked before about doing the less invasive type of approach first to see what happened. Maybe the basin is first, and then later maybe get into this more intensive thing. I don't know what the thinking is. The other issue is that in terms of the basin capturing, and maybe since Brian's here, I think we may get an answer. I don't have it, but I'm wondering where the nutrient loading is coming from. One of those pictures you shows pretty dense development in the vicinity of the pond, and how much nitrogen is entering from the groundwater, from the developments around it, and upstream developments as well, versus what's coming through the bogs. And that would be a question that
That one of these two could
Yeah.
answer.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
I
that,
think-
that was in the report, and Amber did present that on the
Yep.
19th, but if you'd like to come up and speak on it.
I had to leave early on the 19th. So I was there, but
Oh,
I couldn't
that
stay,
time.
I
You-
couldn't
you
stay
went?
that late.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the groundwater coming in from the adjacent shoreline and directly into Mill Pond is bringing in about 900 kilograms of nitrogen. And then the detention pond above the pond is mostly related to the water flowing down through the Bacchus Brook stream.
Mhm.
And the nitrogen and phosphorus removal associated with that detention pond was related to particulates in the water flowing through the stream into the pond. And so the idea is that the detention pond would allow for particulates to settle out in that area instead of flowing into the pond.
So what would be the, pardon me, through the chair.
Yeah, he's
yeah.
looking for the relative contribution of the bogs versus the groundwater from the houses.
I mean, yeah,
So it was approximately 2,500 kilograms of nitrogen total inputs, so minus 900, so around 14 or 1,600 from the stream.
okay.
Thank you.
I gotta say one thing. Didn't say what I said. The detention pond is really for phosphorus. It is not really to increase the nitrogen removal, okay? It's really to trap particulate phosphorus from coming in to save Mill Pond. It's not gonna increase the nitrogen help, it's not gonna help Green Pond very much, but it's part of the recipe for restoring Mill Pond, because phosphorus enters a lot from bogs, and there's not that much nitrogen coming out of those bogs, okay? Not particulate nitrogen.
So Brian, don't leave yet. I've got a question for you too.
I knew you would.
What volume of material would settle out in that settling basin at the upper end of Mill Pond?
I can't tell you exactly, but
I saw some numbers for the mass.
But the accretion rate, the sediment settling in Mill Pond itself is like, what are we down to, 2 millimeters here? Yeah, but it ends up being 500 kilos or whatever.
Around 250.
Okay, so you're getting that kind of settling in Mill Pond itself,
Yeah,
and so that's, we're reducing down. Mill Pond's bigger than this, but.
sure, a lot
but
bigger.
we're placing it right in the bog system, and we're berming it with the hopes that we can slow that water down. You get a lot coming out on when you're doing harvesting.
Yeah.
Things like that, and at different times of year, you get a lot of particles coming out of those bogs.
You know, where I'm headed with this is how often would
Would you have to clean
we
it?
have to pump out the pond, the settling basin, not the pond?
I don't think it would be very much. I mean, if all Mill Pond's going up 2 millimeters a year, even if you've got a centimeter a year, it's 6 feet
Yeah, but
deep,
it's such a
that's
small
2
surface area, I
meters,
wondered.
That's 200 centimeters, and maybe you get a centimeter a year. That's a big accretion rate.
Yeah.
Mississippi Delta's a centimeter a year.
Yeah, I know, I'm just
Yeah,
looking
so-
long-term,
so I
what
don't
kind
think
of
very
commitment we
often-
might be making to have to pump that out every
Well,
so
except-
often.
I
except
think the grower,
Yeah.
the grower is, what he's benefiting from is getting this retention pond, which has apparently been something in his long-range plans for
okay.
quite a while. And he has the equipment to clean his ditches, so he would also have his equipment to clean the settling pond.
And he has a place to dispose of it.
Sorry?
He has a place to dispose of
And
the
he-
material,
that-
which is a big cost.
Another good point.
Ron?
Yeah, so how often do you envision this harvester having to get in there and go after this, especially, let's say, from what, July through August or whatever it
No,
would be?
we would actually, the first year is gonna look pretty much like this, and harvest in the fall. And it has to do with we wanna be taking nitrogen phosphorus out when we take the plants out, so we want a lot of plants. Plus the plants play other roles, that we've found now in sort of the nitrogen attenuation of the pond, so we want the plants to grow up as much as they do. And then hopefully you draw the pond nutrient levels down over time, and then you don't have to harvest every year. You wouldn't harvest more than once a year.
Right.
And probably not that. A couple of years in a row and then skip a year and then, that kind of thing.
So the pond would still look green from the road, basically, until it's harvested. And secondly, what about fragrance?
Well, but remember that you're mining the sediments is what you're doing. You're
Right.
using the plants to suck the nitrogen and phosphorus into their bodies. You
Yeah.
rip the bodies out, you get rid of those, and you keep doing that. and you're getting rid of stuff that is in the sediment, and actually that's what Brewster's doing. Brewster isn't pulling the plants, that harvester cuts the plants. Okay? And so they want the plants to grow each year because they're using the plants to draw the nutrients out of the pond sediments, rather than dredging.
And
But,
just,
but
yeah,
I think what Ron is saying is, okay, you help Green Pond by removing the nitrogen this way.
Yeah.
But have you done what the residents want? The pond still looks green.
Well, we're expecting Mill Pond, as you're mining the sediments and you put in, you had to do like 4 or 5. This is a hybrid fix for Mill Pond. There is no single fix the way the pond's set up. So you got to do a bunch of things. And the idea with a harvester would be the second year they don't grow back as much. You know, the third year they grow back less. It's like people doing Phragmites removal by just clipping. And you know, you have a lot, and then the next year you have a little bit less, and the next year you have a little bit less to harvest each year until pretty much it's
And then at that point, you're removing less nitrogen.
there's less nitrogen to remove.
From the sediment.
just the last thing, I just had one last thing, is that, okay, I realize it's not really socially acceptable, but if the pond were eliminated and it became a wetland, okay, basically, like we're doing with the Coonamessett Basin, basically doing something, would that help?
Well,
Or would
right
that,
now,
in terms of the
pond
issues
is right now removing 64% of the nitrogen that goes through it. That's a lot, for free. It's all the nitrogen, it's not just septic, it's everything.
everything, okay.
So that's a big deal.
Okay.
And so if you get rid of the pond, a wetland, a freshwater wetland is not gonna remove 64% of the nitrogen flowing through it, okay?
Okay. that's
Not even
fine.
all ponds remove that much. I mean, some ponds only remove 10% or something.
Right, okay.
Right, okay. Steve?
Virginia implied that there's a benefit to Handy of having the retention pond.
Yes.
What is that?
It's part of best management practices for cranberry, and over time, many cranberry growers have developed retention ponds at the bottom end of their bog system. It also helps them in controlling when they flood bogs. I'm not a grower, but I know that it is part of best management practices for cranberry growers.
Just a,
Two questions. One of the earlier proposals was that we supply some kind of a filter. Does this settling pond obviate the need for that?
that's the idea, is with the detention pond, you may not need that
Okay.
grate at all.
The other question is about this boat floating around out there. What's the draft?
It's about 20 inches, even when it's loaded.
When it's full,
When loaded?
Even when loaded, he said it doesn't sink down, because what happens is a lot of the water drains out of the macrophytes, so they're heavy and take up a lot of space, or initially they have a lot of water, but it drains, and then they just take up a lot of space.
So what fraction of the area of the pond can it get to?
That's something we'll have to kind of figure out, because the bathymetry here, you know, it's not an exact number that we're looking at. So in a sense, you have to just take it in and try and see what you can do. It's quite likely that we'd be able to get all of this southern region and probably even up into this green right here. Unlikely we'd be able to get up into this small area. But I would say at least 50, possibly 70% or more.
And I also had a commercial question. This 15,000 for the commercial thing, is that an actual quote given the area of the pond, the density, and where it is in New England?
It was a rough number that the
Or is
folks
it,
in Brewster
we
said.
typically do ponds in New England for 15,000?
Yeah, the folks in Brewster who had looked at should we buy one or should we hire somebody, they basically got the number of 15K for whatever.
For their pond?
For whatever they were looking at it, you know, plus or minus a little bit.
I'm just saying, in comparing that to whatever Brewster wants to charge us for borrowing theirs, make sure we compare apples and oranges, because the commercial one, you can make it turnkey.
Yeah.
You said, you know, don't bother me, just make the green stuff disappear. Take it away, and you do all the labor and you clean up afterwards. Whereas Brewster, you borrow it, you have to negotiate with them, you have to take it away, you have to have all kinds of communication and so on.
We should certainly explore what it would cost for real. Just to respond to a couple other concerns, there was this comment about if you don't harvest early, then the pond looks like nothing's happening. Something we may want to consider, this is like a lawnmower. You can set it at different heights. So we could explore the idea of coming in and doing a trim just below the water level, maybe in late June, right before the 4th of July, so everybody comes down and has a clean pond for a couple weeks. And then over the rest of the summer, it continues to grow, and most of the denitrifying
Do the
will stay.
plants like not having their leaves?
At that point in the year, it's kind of like pruning any plant. It's still going to grow, I think, for the most part. I might be wrong about that, but we could consider it as a compromise. And the other question that Ron brought up about why don't we do one, see what happens, and then do the next, I think certainly from a scientific perspective, that makes sense. At the same time, we recognize there are two different things being addressed. One is nitrogen removal and the other is phosphorus removal. And in a total system view, it may make sense to do both at the same time, because the end goal is to preserve and increase Mill Pond's ability to remove nitrogen. And so really the one thing that we're doing is these two measures.
Right.
So
Let me suggest, too, that we not be too concerned about public perception that nothing is happening, because it took years for this situation to get to the point where it is now. And as long as we make it very transparent and make it clear that we're looking at a multi-year process, I think and hope that people will have some faith that we're moving in the right direction. I think that's something to think about.
I remember the very first meeting on this at the East Falmouth Library, the big issue was, is it phosphorus or is it nitrogen? And now, after all this study, we've discovered it's both. So,
I just, a few caveats in this conversation. One is, the reason we said September was peak biomass, but it was also, we don't know what it's gonna smell like when they do this. So we were sort of thinking we would wait till the tourists went home. You know, we don't want to destroy the East Falmouth economy, all right?
Okay, good.
The other thing is on the rent versus buy, the advantage of renting is if it's not to your approval, or it's not the right device, you know, the commercial guy, it's just $15,000, you're done, and it might help you pick a better device. But more important than that, if you make a deal with Brewster, we didn't just talk to them for a few minutes, this is a longer-term discussion. The depth of the discussion was more like, oh, you break it, you bought it kind of thing. You didn't buy it, but you had to repair it. Remember, there's a repair thing. These things break. And so you don't have any of that liability if you can just do the, now I'm not saying you should do that, sort of hoping there'll be a subcommittee or something that meets and maybe can get Brian Handy. I promised him I would bring it up. He really wants to be involved if you're talking about detention ponds and stuff on his property. He's been very good. He's willing to use his own equipment, his own land, not charge anything. But I think that the cost is to engage him in those discussions when you're manipulating his property. So I lived up to that promise.
But the detention, just to clarify, the detention plan and the harvesting are totally decoupled from each
Totally
other, right?
decoupled. You can do one and not the
There's
other.
no technical or political or sociological connection between them.
No, and Virginia hit right on the head. They call them tailwater recovery ponds at the end of bottom. It's been best management practice since the 90s, early mid-90s, where the state did a whole big thing. People from Falmouth were involved. We were involved. They wanted to push detention ponds to trap all this stuff coming out. And they also wanted the bog owners to pump the water back up with all the nutrient-rich water back up if they could. And that's a discussion with Handy we're still having. There's plumbing problems with doing that.
Well, maybe I'm oversimplifying, but what has to be done on the detention plan other than telling Brian Handy, great, go ahead, do it?
There's a thing called Concom in Falmouth. I've heard of them.
Oh, yeah.
I read about them sometimes in the paper and sometimes in the law journals. I read about them.
There are special guidelines for agricultural practices, so it isn't always exactly the same permitting process as it would be if your backyard, you decided to excavate some wetland. But there still is a process that would have to go through. And I think he would expect the town to do that.
Yeah, I think we have to. And we volunteered to help him and you guys just to do that because we want to see that happen in that pond.
Right.
The other thing I want to say is that there's a variety of harvesters too, different types, different shapes, some clip, some pull. And so you have to get a little bit of more thought on to which is the best one. The Brewster one is good. They used it. And actually they used it on a pond that we did the study for them on. okay? So this is their solution on the follow-up to a similar thing as for Mill Pond, and they're happy with it.
What was the name of that pond that they're happy?
I think it was, I think it was Mill Pond.
Okay, thank you.
There's one in every town.
Yep.
Mill Pond Brewster, okay.
All right, so what's the next step here? We want to get something moving for East Falmouth, and we have a selectman in the room and the powerful head of the East Falmouth Village Association. So let's talk. What are we going to do soon to make something happen here? What's the next steps?
I think we need to write a document that describes what we want to do and get that over to Brewster, get a price back, maybe get a quote from,
But you're assuming we want to keep going to Brewster and not go to some private.
we won't get a number from them unless we write something.
I think you need both numbers.
So,
Okay.
and I think we'd want that document to send to a private contractor as well, saying, basically, when do we want it done? And
Yep.
this is where we come in and
Okay.
things like that, whether it's once or twice a year. So we just need basically a one-page, maybe Doug wants to jump in.
I'd like to try to use Brewster's equipment and have their guy come down and show our guy how to do it. We were thinking if one of the Falmouth DPW guys with a hoisting license could work on the harvester with the guy from Brewster, we'd get an added bonus, because the private contractor is not gonna, let us on board and show us how to do stuff. And I'd rather give the money to a neighboring town than to a private company that's probably from who knows where. And also, it's not really determined what the cost would be. We can put the proposal out, see what they say, probably do better. I don't know exactly. And maybe there'd be some other kind of sharing going on between Falmouth and Brewster, and it might be a good relationship.
Okay. And for,
I was at the meeting also with Brian, and I was under the impression that we were gonna hire the crane, because he doesn't have a crane.
Oh.
So that might be one more thing that we have to do. I didn't hear him say he had a crane.
I agree with that. So I guess I did talk about Mill Pond first. So we need a description of what we want done for the harvesting in Mill Pond. And we also need to pursue the Concom permit for the detention pond.
all right, Brian's got to be the applicant.
He'll be the applicant. Someone needs to shepherd the process, make sure he knows what needs to be done.
Okay.
Sure.
Steve?
I totally respect what Doug just said, and please interpret my remarks about comparing the commercial versus the one from Brewster, as that the price from Brewster should perhaps be significantly less than the commercial price, because it doesn't include a lot of the features that the commercial one does, including what Brian mentioned, the possibility of breaking it.
Right, I agree. Well, you guys will decide.
We got a very good feeling from them that they want to help.
But we get that, but he's right, what if it breaks? Maybe you should do your RFP, so to speak, and send it to Brewster and to a private.
Yeah.
Or more than one private person, just to get a sampling of.
Yeah.
The comparative value.
Yep, and I think we need a permit for this access too, so that's the other thing,
Mhm.
piece of the puzzle.
In terms of timing, the settlement work is there a time when that can be done or can't be done?
The ideal thing for the detention pond is to get that in place before he begins operation next year. And so by, I think, late March is what he said. We'd like to, so we'd try to get all the permit in place, and it would probably take less than a week to do the actual site work. But the ground needs to be not frozen.
Who would be the procurement agent for this thing?
Well, that's a fair question.
Would it be the DPW or, because then it's up to them really to figure out.
Well, if it's a deal with Brewster, it's an intermunicipal agreement, so that has some
Right.
flexibility. If it's a private person, if the cost is 15,000 or less, that's got some flexibility.
I think we can still get a price without having a official procurement process, right?
We should fly this by the town's procurement officer before we
Before we ask.
get too far.
Okay. So that'd be the next step.
Well, you got a couple of next steps here.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, okay.
Okay, any other comments from the
Mary
committee?
Ellen, I think
Yes, Mary Ellen. Who got the ball rolling a couple of years ago?
Mary Ellen Alwa, East Falmouth Village Association. There was one area I wasn't really clear in all the information I'm trying to take in, and that was, and probably Brian or Amber could answer for me, and that was the difference, if there is one, in pulling up or cutting the weeds. Would one of those be better for Mill Pond than the other, or does it matter at all?
If you leave them in. To the mic, please. Our nationwide TV audience.
It was Walker's Pond in Brewster. All right, we did 3 of them, but Walker's is the one they harvested. If you clip them, you're assured they're gonna grow back. If you pull them, you're gonna get a lot more out. But then the question is, are you gonna get the same things back? Our experience in not in this, but in not doing it, but in talking to people that have trying to get rid of hydrilla and those other noxious invasives, is it's really hard to get rid of these plants. You know, even if we pull them out, we're still gonna have regrowth for a number of years until the environment changes. So you get more out, though, if you can pull them.
But you don't want them out, right? You want them to come back for
As long
several
as they
years.
grow, I mean, I was going, Brewster clips. We were figuring if we used Brewster, we'd just use the clipping one. Most of them clip. There's only one on the market now that pulls.
But I thought that your whole
Used to have them
program was
grow and mine it, but the thing
keep
is
them
they
for
would grow
several
back
seasons.
but they will grow back anyway, all right?
even if you pull them up.
Yeah, but for me personally, I'd rather clip them because then we know they'll come back and we have access to clipping ones. And there's only one pulling harvester that I could find so far available anywhere that they make. So therefore, we're really limited in our choices at that point. And if you're going to go to a commercial entity, which I sort of lean a little bit towards for a single pilot, then you sort of have to go with what they have. And so we'd have to really search hard. And I would like to see this go in September, but I'm worried if you bought one, can you actually buy it, get it here, train it, and get it in the
Nobody's
pond?
proposing that. It's
No.
renting it versus,
Right.
from a commercial source versus renting it from Brewster.
I know why I said mine. Brewster, whatever happens, if the town of Falmouth or any other town decided that this is a good thing they want to do and they need to have their own harvester, Brewster, the town administrator, manager, his concept in the discussion was that maybe we could set up a multi-town collaborative to offer these services to other towns as well, and that might help pay for the equipment for the various towns that participate, and at most, it's only gonna be 2 or 3 towns. There's just not that many that need this service.
Well,
That's why I said-
he already owns one.
Yeah, but that harvester is not every pond's harvester. It has difficulties if the water's shallow near shore, it's hard to launch, because it tips like this, and the operator was saying getting it in the pond's difficult. Mill Pond, it should work because you picked a deep spot, and that's why you look for the deep spot to get access to. But we're talking about other towns and other ponds, if you wanted to get in a collaborative, and having only one that's hits the bottom and needs special conditions for launching would not be a good business plan.
The pond in Brewster, did it improve in quality? What happened?
They've only been doing this recently, and they're very hot on it. They think it's gonna be great. We'll know next year.
Okay.
Brand new to them, too. Only had a year, I think.
Any other comments or questions? And they already bought one. Okay.
I guess they did see it as an ongoing project because they think it's going to take many years to extract the stored nutrients. We're not sure exactly whether we'd want to do it every year or every other year. So,
Right.
doing a first, basically the idea is they're hoping to support us in a pilot, and then we can have discussions about an ongoing, maybe sharing one, maybe.
2 families sharing a lawnmower is not a good idea. One person should own it, the other person should rent it.
One piece that hasn't been covered yet, so suppose we successfully harvest next September, where does Brewster take its harvested material, and where do you think we would take ours?
Yeah, I ran through it pretty quick. It just goes to compost. So they
Goes-
take it on the trailer and would take it to the town compost area.
Town
That's what they
compost.
do with theirs.
Okay.
Perfect. Okay, any other comments or questions? We want to move this along. Eric, you seem to be the point person now. in terms of drafting these things and getting the Concom piece going and all of that. But when it comes time for money, I think we'll rely on the selectmen to harvest some of that. Probably.
Our expectation was Amber would continue to be involved in both of these projects. She's got more intimate knowledge than probably any other person on the planet of the details of Mill Pond at this point. So that's very valuable.
Great.
Good.
Good.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you all for carrying the ball and running with it.
And Eric, I think it's our sense that we're going to pursue both of these avenues.
Yeah, we certainly need to articulate on paper what the project is. There are two different projects. They both have some kind of permitting pathway that is needed, and that needs to be laid out. And then ultimately, there may be a funding piece.
Yeah, so we'll outline that and circulate it.
Okay. Now, from East Falmouth, we go to Nantucket. Yes.
One last comment about the Mill Pond. Amber had other suggestions also. There was like 4 options.
So Eric hit on the main 2 suggestions. The third recommendation was either alum treatment in the pond to the sediments, which would bind with the phosphorus being released out of the sediments, thus reducing the internal phosphorus load from the sediments. The other was to put in aerators throughout the pond. It would probably require multiple locations just due to the size of the pond, but aeration would also keep the bottom water aerated throughout the summer so that it doesn't go anaerobic, releasing that phosphorus during the anaerobic period. So those were the other 2 options. And then the 4th option was what Ron had mentioned about dam removal, but we really don't think that's a good idea at all. Yes, or, sorry. Flow through for the residence time. So yeah, during certain times of the year when Brian Handy is flooding his bogs for harvest and winter flood, the residence time in the pond comes to almost a complete halt. The water essentially that comes into the pond does not leave the pond until he releases the boards, restoring flow through the pond. So during that time, it was thought that maybe at the Route 28 end of the pond, we could remove a board to help allow some flow and flushing through the pond during that time while he's flooding the bogs. It was, I think in our discussions last week, it was still determined whether or not that would be a good idea, even for Brian's cranberry operation as well. So, yeah.
I like this remote mic.
All right. Nantucket. We all remember the Falmouth fertilizer control bylaw that prevented people from fertilizing within 100 feet of our coastal estuaries. We send out a letter every year to all these people, all these property owners, and that is so far the extent of our town's effort to deal with people putting nitrogen on their lawns within 100 feet of the estuaries. Nantucket has gone a step further, and we're going to hear about that now.
So Nantucket actually has a full-on program for the commercial fertilizer applicators. It's a whole licensing program. So the program was implemented due to the Massachusetts Estuaries Report on both Nantucket and Madacot Harbor. And the program was designed as one approach to help reduce total nitrogen and help meet the TMDL. So even though the program was based off of these 2 watersheds, it's actually a town-wide program, so it's not location-specific. Everywhere in the town has to abide by the program. So the program itself was developed by the Natural Resource Department. It is actively managed and enforced by both Natural Resource Department and the Board of Health. The program itself requires that all individual commercial landscapers applying fertilizer in the town hold a license. This means that every person working for a company who may apply fertilizer has to carry a license with them. There's not an umbrella license for companies. To get the license, it's a pretty straightforward procedure. Again, it's individual applicators. They all have to go through a fertilizer permitting course. This is offered by the Board of Health. They offer it multiple times through the course of the year, primarily in spring through early summer. So they start probably around March, go through June. It's a 2-hour course, and it follows their best management practices for fertilizer use on Nantucket. Their best management practices were actually initiated in 2013. The course itself costs $100 per individual, and once you've completed your course, your license is good for 3 years. Renewal is by retaking the course. It's not just a renewal fee. I was in contact with the assistant director for the Board of Health out on Nantucket, and one of the inquiries I made was how was the program received by the community? And his response was that there was really no opposition from either the commercial landscapers or from the private homeowners. Everyone was aware that there was an issue and something needed to be done, and the concept for the program was very well received. So the program was developed primarily to target the commercial aspect because that's where the bulk of the fertilizers are being applied through. Individual homeowners are allowed to apply fertilizer. They're encouraged to follow best management practices. Homeowners are not required to obtain a license. The program itself is very well laid out online, very easily accessible for public information. So they also provide a list of who's holding current licenses by names. The 2017 list, there was approximately 500 individuals on there. They do a lot of outreach. This is the example of the annual flyer that goes out to the homeowners. So it goes through some of what is the best management practice for fertilizer application, why it's important, what to look for when you're hiring a landscaper. So over here, you can see this little barcoded. That is the actual license that they encourage all their homeowners to look for when landscapers are on their property. That is what they're looking for as far as ensuring that you're certified. They also have a very similar looking 2-page brochure that's readily available, town offices, again, all about the program. The last piece is enforcement. So it's a joint effort between both the Natural Resource Department and the Board of Health. Enforcement is mainly done by compliance checks. So part of the difficulty is being able to access private properties. So both the Natural Resources Department and Board of Health have a member on their staff who go out and do compliance check, and it's primarily passive monitoring. So they'll go and speak with landscapers who are actively applying fertilizers, check and ensure that they're carrying their licenses. They'll also go during rain events to make sure that there's no application of fertilizers during that period. That's pretty much the general overview of the program. In speaking with the Assistant Director for Board of Health, he was very forthcoming with information when I told him that the Water Quality Management Committee was looking at whether a program might be feasible for Falmouth. He emphasized that this was just one part of what they're doing as far as trying to meet their TMDL. They do have other programs that they're working with, and was very, very freely giving of information, so.
Do they encourage the homeowners to audit the course perhaps for free?
Not that I was made aware of. So
Okay.
the best management practice guide is available online.
Right.
So it's all right there as part of the program.
Right, I just thought it might be good for interested homeowners to be able to sit in on the course.
I'm not really sure what
Yeah.
percentage of homeowners would actually be
Yeah,
applying.
it may be a
for
small percentage, but it
Right.
is, again, all part of the outreach program, I think.
Steve?
Do you have any idea how the number of acres of fertilized land on Nantucket compares to that in Falmouth?
I have no idea on that.
I was astounded when you see there are 500 landscapers out there.
So if you look at it from the perspective of if your license is good for 3 years, you may have a very large seasonal pool that might spend their summer on Nantucket, a college kid who just spends a year there, but they're still active for a 3-year period on the list, but they might not actually be there.
In my experience, no one on Nantucket mows their own lawn.
Well, yes, yes, I hear you.
A property in Nantucket sold last week. I think it was the most expensive property in the entire state for $25 million. So
Yeah.
that could account for a lot of landscaping licenses there in one property.
Right.
Yeah, do you know how this was enacted? Was it through the town meeting there, or was it somehow, just wondering, because we have a rather fickle town meeting?
That I'm not sure. I know that it was developed and implemented by the Natural Resource Department, and how the Board of Health got involved, that I am not sure.
My guess is through the Board of Health, but that's just a guess.
Yeah, that would be worth knowing.
Do they have any way of guessing how much better things are with this program than without it?
I haven't seen any data from that, but that's something I can certainly follow up with
I
the
mean,
Board
I
of
have no
Health.
idea how one would ever know that. But
It sounds like, the enforcement aspect keeps them very busy, and again, it's passive monitoring, and they use it from an educational outreach perspective, to make sure that the landscapers are informed, and again, promote the benefits for the program. The fact that the program was as well received as it is, it sounds like that there's not much opposition and people aren't trying to skirt it.
Could we find out how many citations for violations they issue in the course of a year?
Yes.
Our bylaw is different in that we have something that says no fertilizing within the 100 feet of these water bodies. They don't have that?
They have a very similar bylaw. What the actual restriction for the water body is, that I
Yeah.
do not
I mean,
recall.
that is the unique piece in the Falmouth one. No fertilizer within 100 feet. And of course, if you drive around in a boat, you see lots of green lawns within 100 feet, which makes you think maybe people aren't all following that bylaw. But,
well, there's could be, this presentation is about how it's licensed and enforced.
Right, but
What
she's
is in the program, we don't know.
Well, we're looking for follow-up questions for her to
Right.
pursue.
But we also have, 6 months off, right? So from October to April, there's no fertilizer. Isn't that right? Something like that?
Yes, that's right.
But they've got pretty decent
anybody.
revenue from this program, 500 times 100.
100.
That's
and,
true.
Over
that could potentially help with enforcement. If we were thinking about doing something
Right.
similar, we might need to create a position.
Yeah.
I don't
or a
believe that the
half-time position for
positions
somebody.
are strictly for that. I think
Sure.
it's added responsibility onto someone else.
Well, it's 50,000 divided by 3, so you can't
Yeah, over
support
3
too much
years,
of it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a full-time, but it might,
Right.
you might be able to add it to somebody's job duties.
Yeah. Interesting. Any other comments or questions from the committee or from the people who wrote the MEP for Nantucket? They're good. Okay. Thank you. It's very useful. Draft proposal for West Falmouth Harbor in situ sediment remediation discussion. This was sent around to all the members. Everybody's had a chance to look at it. Now the world will share it.
Okay, I don't think
Yeah,
so.
it didn't,
It
that
didn't
didn't.
go
I don't
down.
think
No,
it
no, no.
circulated.
No,
Oh,
this is an introduction.
oh, I
So there-
apologize.
Yep, so there has been some effort to look at ways to address the stored nutrients that are in sediments and typically present themselves as black muck on the bottom. And one of the strategies that seems to attract a lot of attention is the idea of delivering oxygen to these sediments without disturbing them necessarily, but just getting somehow the oxygen down there so that metabolism can work through what's there. So what we're going to talk about today is oxygen nanobubbles. This is something that has been lab tested. It's something that has been used, I would say, more widely in Asia than it has in the rest of the world. And so some of this technology has been published in Chinese journals and actually put into practice in the field. There's a fellow working here who's got an association with the University of Nottingham in the UK, but also works over in China. And they put together an experiment that got published earlier this year in Science of the Total Environment, where they took oxygen nanobubble modified zeolites, so that's what ONMZ stands for, and oxygen nanobubble modified sediments, which are local sediments from the same region that they got the sediments in these sample tubes, and essentially put them in an oven, dried them out, and then put pure oxygen in the chamber, pressurized it for half an hour, and then took them out. And lo and behold, it seems to store oxygen on the material. The zeolite is a combination of silicon and aluminum tetrahedra with oxygen bonds in between them and around them. And so you can pack a lot of oxygen into these porous materials. And it turns out when you put them in water, the nanobubbles start to form on the surface, and the oxygen sort of comes off in these little nanobubbles and diffuses out of the nanobubble into the bulk water. And turns out also goes into the sediments. So they put some probes in so they can monitor the oxygen reduction potential. Turns out that you're able to increase the dissolved oxygen concentration and also change this oxygen reduction potential in a fashion that suggests there's metabolism being driven by the presence of oxygen in the sediments. So lab scale demonstration using real sediments and materials that are believed to be inert aside from the delivery of oxygen to the local.
No flow, with no flow.
That's correct. This is a lab experiment.
But it's a passive process is what you're saying, Steve, right?
Yep.
Just a passive.
Well, there's nothing to take it away.
Yeah.
Once you get the oxygen, you don't have to keep supplying it to each tide change.
Yep. So just to be clear, there's a material deposited on top of the sediment that has the nanobubbles in it. The point is, if you can get the nanobubbles there, they will deliver oxygen that will go into the sediments. So this is not speculation, this is proven. So the idea of getting oxygen nanobubbles down there seems enticing as an in situ remediation strategy. Just to talk about bubbles a little bit, since we did try an aeration project that did not seem to have the desired effect because it was driving mass transport of water. Just want to compare nanobubbles with other bubbles. So the bubbles that we used previously are bigger. They're typically in the sort of hundreds of microns to maybe a couple millimeter diameter. A bubble like that has a low pressure gas inside, and it's going to rise because it's lighter than the water that's around it. Nanobubble, on the other hand, is so small that the balance of forces causes a high pressure gas to exist inside, and the bubble doesn't have enough energy to rise in the water column, and it will typically just stay there and bounce around in a Brownian fashion. And while it's doing that, the contents of the bubble will just diffuse into the water. And if you put pure oxygen inside, you're likely to get dissolved oxygen in the surrounding environment. Turns out you can put other things in the nanobubbles too, but we're just going to talk about oxygen today. There is a location over in West Falmouth Harbor where we found a ton of muck, went out there with Ann Giblin from the MBL and pulled a couple cores and took pictures of them, and there's muck down there. And there seems to be an area where there aren't moorings, where we could put in 3 or so fields, 1 as a control and 2 as treatment sites. We're attempting to deliver oxygen nanobubbles to those sites. There's a picture at the bottom here that shows a PVC frame that's underwater. The idea is we'd have about a 10-foot by 10-foot area that works out to around 10 square meters on the interior. And we'd put some instrumentation inside and then try a couple different strategies for getting the nanobubbles down there. So it's, this is a schematic of one possible approach where you have a floating raft that has power for the instrumentation and also for a ultrafine or nanobubble mixing pump that will deliver nanobubble-rich water to the layer that it's in. Works particularly well if you have a stratified environment to maybe keep those nanobubbles right where they are. People have studied the motion of these nanobubbles using lasers. They're pretty easy to see with the right instrumentation. But to my knowledge, there's nobody who's tried this for an in situ delivery of nanobubbles. So it's a little bit of a question, what's going to happen, as you were saying, when you have flow, when you have temperature, salinity gradients, all kinds of things. And the whole point of this project would be to take a look at it. There's a picture of an actual pump. Doesn't look too complicated. The idea behind this project is that we'd get the Marine Biological Laboratory to do sediment sampling throughout the summer, and we'd get some nanobubble equipment and materials to attempt to deliver these nanobubbles. Estimated budgets are up there, a total of $25,000. We believe the deployment would be compatible with a 10A permit. That's a state permit that the harbor master can issue. And the equipment would be deployed in early June of next year, and the treatment would be monitored throughout July and August. So that's the pitch for in situ remediation.
Could you go back to the locations and
Yep.
Tell folks where we're talking about?
Yep, so this is West Falmouth Harbor here. The harbor entrance from Buzzards Bay is over on the left-hand side of the screen. And then you come around the corner, there's this shallow area is where there are a bunch of oysters that got relayed from Bourne's Pond earlier this year. And then you come around the corner, this is the bridge going out to Chappaquiddick Beach right here. So it's north of that bridge, and it's south of this area that's called Harbor Head. There is a sizable yacht on this dock right here, but that yacht is not going to try to get out over this region. They're going to navigate basically down towards the channel and then up this way.
So you only have one site?
So it's one site where we would have 3 locations delineated by these on the bottom markers.
Two questions. First, you mentioned at the very beginning that there had been some field work done in China on this sort of thing, or somewhere. Is any of that written up?
So this paper that you're looking at the outset here is actually a paper that came out of some of the work that has been done with oxygen nanobubbles, and they're primarily trying to use them to attack harmful algal blooms, not sediment remediation. So when I say there's been a lot of work, it's not sediment-related work. It's just using nanobubbles in algae control situations and things like that. So as they considered the total ecosystem, there's this realization we need to get to the sediments, and that's where this idea of putting a layer of oxygen-charged materials right on the bottom.
But it might be good if several members of this group read that paper.
Sure.
And my other comment was, I would want to know before voting yes on any experiment like this, what's the back of the envelope business plan to do this at scale if the laboratory experiment, the field experiments worked according to your wildest dreams?
Yep. So in an ideal world, you'd have the ability to not apply any materials to the bottom, but maybe take advantage of stratification or some other serendipitous miracle that keeps those nanobubbles on the sediments long enough to diffuse in. And all you have to do is deploy an appropriate array of pumps during the critical times to get that oxygen down in there. Not a tremendously expensive proposition necessarily, just a permitting issue.
Yeah, but I'd still like to see the numbers for what the dollars per acre per foot thick per year.
That's a good point. Replicability
Yep.
and what it costs for a larger effort.
We had to do that when we talked about this. Sia and Ron and I were working on the idea of a bed of wood chips to remove nitrogen from a stream. And it doesn't take more than an hour to do the numbers to know what your goal has to be.
Yep.
And it informs whether the experiments make any sense at all.
Right.
Did we have a working group for that one? For that experiment last year on Coonamessett River?
I know there was some communication. I'm not sure if there was a formal group.
Oh, that's a different, that was the experiment that Ann Giblin and et al. Did with the bigger boat, with Eric Kay, right?
I think the question we're mixing.
I was just saying by analogy to doing a business plan first,
Okay, gotcha.
was that the working group consisting of Ron and myself and Sia did a little business plan so we knew
Right.
what the laboratory experiments had to show. And when they didn't show it, we said, okay, we admit it doesn't work. And you also know that way, I mean, if sometimes the numbers come out that are so absurd that there's no point doing the experiment.
Eric, I know
Tom.
vanishingly small amount of material about nanobubbles, but do you need a separate generator for each replicated site?
Not necessarily, depends on the layout.
Reason I'm asking is Mike McGrath has a nanobubble generator.
Oh, does he?
And I know nothing about the capabilities or any of these things, but, and I don't know why he has it, but I do know that he has a nanobubble generator, and it may be possible, similar to what we're talking about down Cape with harvesting weeds, maybe you could collaborate with him
Absolutely.
and
Even
find out,
stranger.
but it's just completely serendipitous that he mentioned to me Tuesday morning that he has a nanobubble
I was
generator.
gonna say, it's even odder that
Reverse
you know that he
Murphy.
has one.
But anyway, just a thought.
Yeah.
Okay, Ron?
There's a huge amount of literature on this. Zeolites have been used in aquaculture for a long time, and they have very limited effectiveness. And mostly it's used to remove ammonia or to control ammonia in systems. But the basic assumption is that it's better to manage the water quality to prevent the issue as much as possible. Now we do have compromised water bodies here, but there's a very limited effectiveness. In other words, its usefulness is short-lived. And once those bubbles are out, then you have to continue. So I think that there needs to be a good literature review done of this methodology and see if what adds up, following along with what Steve was saying. But there's a vast amount of knowledge. A lot of it was in aquaculture. So it's, controlling these, economic systems, basically. And it's again, it's almost, we may be stepping back into the last trial that you mentioned where we had bigger bubbles. But it was very optimistic view on what would happen, and
Extremely
yet
optimistic.
it didn't do much. So I think we need to do a little more homework and really see where this might lead, because there is a lot of information
Yep.
available, easily accessible.
Yeah, so I think retracing our steps a little bit, the idea behind the solar bee and the aeration system was get the top aerated water down to the bottom, right? Because the oxygen's already there. And what we found is,
Actually, you put the bubblers right in they were put right in the bottom, right?
the bubblers were put in the bottom, but not to deliver oxygen, to cause the motion of water.
Well, right, what I'm saying is there's a lot of literature on exactly what you're talking about, and it really hasn't done much, and there's a
That's good advice.
significant
See if
cost, so I think it should be
Do
Yeah.
that.
a good review.
I agree there's a lot of literature on nanobubbles. Haven't seen a lot getting it into the sediments, and so that's really the piece that we're trying to get our brain around is,
Well, have a look in the aquaculture literature.
yes,
There's a lot there,
Okay.
a lot there.
maybe you can send some of it over, if you're aware of some of it.
Okay, I can, yeah. Well, I mean, you just Google it.
Okay.
It's all there.
So another
looking.
obvious issue with West Falmouth Harbor one would have to approach those property owners. And that's right along a stretch of coast where there are lovely old homes. And if you're gonna put a raft out there, it seems to me you're gonna need to talk to some neighbors very quickly.
Yes.
So, in that regard, this point right here has no homes and no immediate vista. So this little area is a little bit hidden except for maybe a few houses right in this area. I wouldn't say it's a lot of houses. And there are boats there, but I agree. It wouldn't be invisible.
Right.
Absolutely.
Comments, questions?
So next steps are that we see something formal on
Yeah.
paper?
Yeah, come back with.
Yeah, some references, basically.
No, is there gonna be a formal proposal with or was that it?
This is a PowerPoint version of
Okay.
the proposal. There is text to go with
Okay,
it.
then I have a question. So who is this proposal being, is it MBL or ScienceWares or both?
ScienceWares isn't doing this.
Okay,
We're technical consultants to the town of Falmouth, suggesting that this technology could be effective. So we would help form the project and oversee its
okay. I'm
conduct.
just curious why MBL isn't here to present it.
Because it's only in the discussion
Okay.
stage.
Yeah.
If there's something.
Yeah, if we want to follow up on it.
forward,
This is just a
they'll be
feeling
here.
out process.
Yeah,
Okay.
Exactly.
this is the first time you're hearing about it at all.
And Ann has reviewed the papers and been out to the site and is favorably disposed at this point.
Your sense is there's two participants in this, the MBL and
A company that would supply equipment could be,
Mike
Yeah,
McGrath.
could be Mike.
Mike McGrath.
Again, it's, I know that much about nanobubbles, so,
It's good, we'll find out what he's got.
right.
Steve,
I just want to repeat, it's one of
Yeah.
my guiding principles that it's counterintuitive and very depressing to the enthusiastic researcher, but the best policy is to look for the cheapest, fastest way to show that your idea won't work.
Absolutely.
And so I think the business plan on the back of the envelope is cheap and fast and should be done before talking to homeowners.
Yeah.
You know, you just
Yeah.
get the
We'll
price of
Find out what
electricity
Mike
and pumps and
paid
so
for
on.
his nanobubble generator and take it from there.
Because if it's gonna cost twice as much as dredging and take 50 times as long, I'm not sure what the experiments would show.
okay, any other comments or questions? Okay, thank you. Next item on the agenda, report on a Walkway Bay Annual Cape Coastal Conference, which Tom attended.
Right, I attended, I don't,
I'm surprised to hear you're making a report.
no, I'm not surprised. I had intended on saying something, but they haven't posted the results yet. They post them online, the content, all the presentations. But I did send out the agenda, detailed agenda today.
Thank
Just
you.
if
Yes.
people had specific questions about any of the topics there, but my feedback to you would be semi-quantitative, if that, conceptual. Anybody have anything? The second day was, I will tell you, most of the aquaculture stuff was sort of old news. Wrightsmith stuff was the paper from, was it 7 years ago they did that work or whatever? He just repeated the numbers from there. The Shellfish Initiative is a big thing in Massachusetts, and I was surprised at the nearshore harvest. This excludes sea scallops and mahogany clams and surf clams and stuff like that. There's $25 million in 2017, and aquaculture production was $28 million last year in 2017. So the aquaculture is already surpassing the commercial harvest, wild harvest, I guess we would call it, which I was surprised. Everybody's in love with oysters. I can tell you it's it's a growing push. In Mashpee, they're still very optimistic that they're going to solve most of their problems with shellfish, and I'm pessimistic. Wellfleet, the concern is that they'll produce so many shellfish that the price will be depressed, that the commercial people won't have any interest in shellfishing. So that was kind of an interesting spin there. As I said, the second day, which they were talking about resiliency, I don't know how many people know this, but there's a municipal vulnerability program that the state is very interested in. Falmouth is near the front of the pack in that. I went to the selectmen's meeting Monday night where Elise Leduc from
Thank
Woods
you
Hole
both.
Group presented what they were doing here in Falmouth, and that is very
Who
impressive.
did the presentation?
Uh,
Who did the presentation?
Elise Leduc with
Oh,
Woods Hole
Elise.
Group.
Yeah.
And the interest right now is just on municipal assets, but I also see it growing to all kinds of infrastructural things in time. But right now, the focus is purely on municipal, but they're building an amazing framework, elevations of every building structure in town that's municipally owned, the elevations of openings, doors, windows, the elevation of assets within those buildings is all going into this database, so that if we know the tide is going to peak at 4.3 feet, they can point to the presumably critical assets that are at risk under those conditions. So that to me is an amazing project. I'm not sure what else to say. Does anybody have a specific?
I wanted to ask whether you had attended the watershed permit case study, which was with Pleasant Bay.
Yes, I did.
Okay, well, and it says the speakers were Mike Giggy.
Yes.
Was he there?
Yes.
Was Carol Ridley, who's from?
Yeah, they were all there, and they were very pleased with themselves.
Okay. Did they actually pass out a watershed permit, or did they just talk about where they are in the planning process?
They talked about where they are in the process.
Okay.
But again, and I don't know what the time frame will be, I'm gonna try to get in touch with the people at Webner to see. I went back and explored last year's conference, and they do post everything.
Sure.
So what I'm suggesting, maybe, rather than have everybody dig into it, maybe I could summarize a couple of things and come
That would
back
be
and
great.
report later.
That would be great.
Good.
And turnout, I mean, how,
There were probably 300 people. I was very
really?
impressed. I personally had not ever heard of this conference, and I've talked to several other people that I think are kind of plugged in to this sort of stuff. They didn't know it existed.
It's been around for 6 years.
Yeah.
Right, that's what I say,
This is the
surprised.
sixth year.
This is the sixth one.
I think there's, over three, I was on the organizing
Right,
committee.
yeah, you got lots of publicity there,
Unable to
Matt.
attend the meeting that I helped organize, unfortunately, but
Yeah.
my understanding is they draw between 350 and 400 people on an annual basis.
Yes, I think total of the 2 days, because I did notice
Yeah.
there was a core that hit both days, probably for the free lunch. But, I think the first day they announced that there were 330 people there.
Wow.
And so I imagine with the second group looked to me to be as crowded as the first group, and with a slightly different crowd. But, it's well worth going to. I was very, very impressed.
Any other comments or questions?
Thank you.
Thank you, yes. I have a few quick announcements. All of you by now have received Dr. Foreman's annual invitation to his presentation by all of his students. It's going to take place on Friday, the 14th, starting at 8:20 in the morning and going all day.
And I'm one of the judges, so come and cheer me on.
Okay. It's definitely worth going. Certainly the first
Well, It's gonna, yeah,
2 hours in the morning address the kind of things we're spending our
Yeah.
time on. So that's fun. We got word from the Buzzards Bay Coalition that the DEP has approved the application for site-specific piloting use at the West Falmouth Fire Station, which this group has
For an IA.
volunteered
Yeah.
to help fund for an IA, yes. The town has now sent to the county a request for extending the agreement that funds that and the other installations in West Falmouth. Currently, the coalition has 10 committed locations, but they haven't been reimbursed for the 10 because they haven't all been installed yet. So we need an extension for that reason. So the county is prepared to give it, and the town has asked for it. Anybody else have any comments, updates? Okay, minutes.
yeah.
Everybody received their minutes? Does anyone have any comments or questions or amendments to the minutes? Tom?
Yes. Up top, just below the link to the video thing, I think it's called the Falmouth Enterprise. So I would just put Falmouth in front of where it says the Enterprise.
Where is this?
Oh, I see.
It's the second line underneath the link to the video.
Recently featured
Oh.
in the Falmouth.
The
yeah.
Falmouth Enterprise, that's a real minor thing. And then when we're discussing the Long Island situation, we've got a comparative thing that says notably farther behind. I think we should make that relative to what's happening in Massachusetts or Cape Cod or Falmouth, down below under point number 2, Ken Zegel's presentation. It says Suffolk County seems to be notably farther behind.
Behind Massachusetts, is that?
Yeah, I'm
Yes,
just saying, I think
yes.
we should put something in there as.
Okay.
Yeah, otherwise it sounds like
Yes.
Suffolk County is retarded.
Yes,
Yes.
right.
No, certainly not.
And in that closing sentence, I thought we might quantify it a little better. Like I said, the number that stood out in my mind, and I don't have the PowerPoint deck, I haven't gone back to look at it. But the number that stuck in my mind was, I thought he said it was $100,000 per residence to sewer.
He did.
Right. And what are our numbers for Falmouth? They're a third of that, right?
Well,
The Cape
Depends
Wide
where they
number
are.
is like 50.
Yeah, I know it depends
For
on where they are.
Little Pond Sewer Service Area, it turned out to be 13,000.
Right.
Right, but I'm just saying,
For
if-
No, I
the
think-
original estimates were more like 40,000,
Yeah.
40 to 50.
but anyway, I would just rewrite that sentence to reflect, seem to be substantially higher or something, I
Yeah,
think.
right, the 10
When
to
we say
20
10 to 20,000,
Right,
it's
10 to 20
it's
doesn't,
tighter number there than I think it should be, so,
they just take out 10 to 20, so it says higher
yeah, I would say substantially.
substantially.
Yeah,
Okay.
because that's,
All right, before you move on
Yeah.
further, so in 2, there's also one error, and it's the very last sentence of that section 2. The committee agreed ScienceWare staff would review the report for potential edits. That's my error. That sentence belongs back up in 1 as the last sentence of 1, because we were discussing the trends analysis that had been done by House. And we ended it with saying that we would have ScienceWare's review the report for edits. So, I'm sorry, I just got it in the wrong place.
So that's
In
sort
that
of a-
same paragraph that
Okay,
Virginia was
here we
just
go.
talking about, I mean, again, I don't know how important the minutes really are, but, ever are, but there needs to be something said about Falmouth between the statement of Matt's and the one of mine. Otherwise, it sounds like we're talking about what Suffolk County should do.
Okay,
Because that whole section 2 is about Suffolk County and so
True.
on.
that's
And
true.
then Matt says, is there potential to get more company buy-ins? And Steve says, like, 2 to 3 companies.
Okay, so you
Where
wanna
did
say-
they fly in from?
You want to say in Falmouth, you want to
Okay.
say somewhere here.
Okay, suppose we start that paragraph with regard to Falmouth, Matt Charette questioned,
Fine.
blah, blah, blah. And then Steve Layton
wonderful.
recommended, okay? So, start that paragraph with regard to Falmouth.
Any other proposed amendments or additions or corrections?
get down to my report on the aquaculture committee, it says questions the town's criteria. What I discussed about those meetings focused on the town's criteria. Right now, we don't have any. We're trying to develop them.
Okay, so how do you want to fix it?
I would just, instead of questioned, I would just say, and focused on
There we
the
go.
town's criteria.
Okay,
That's one of the very first things we're trying to do moving forward, to get that in place so we can get proposals out and see what kind of response we get.
okay.
Is everybody comfortable with all of those corrections and additions? Okay,
Can I drop a comma?
of course.
The paragraph above that, that starts with Matt Charette, the very last, that's almost all one sentence. No, there's 2 sentences in there. After development of new technologies, there's a superfluous comma there.
Okay,
So-
So,
I have
And
no-
that's
about a
my
motion?
last tiny little,
motion to approve the minutes,
thanks, Matt.
including the changes that we just discussed.
Second.
perfect.
Good.
Okay,
I'm in
discussion?
favor.
All in favor?
Yes.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. Okay, Matt?
And a motion to adjourn, please.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Discussion. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Next
Opposed?
meeting?
The ayes have it.
Hey,
20th.
2 weeks, on the 20th.
So, you'll send me